Good morning and welcome to the IR Theory interview series. I am Dr. Jon Åberg, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Global Political Studies at Malmö University, Sweden. In this interview series, we interview IR scholars about their preferred theoretical perspectives. The idea is to get a brief account of why scholars have come to appreciate a certain IR theory through a short interview. Today, I have the honor to interview a great scholar. Welcome, Professor Pinar Bilgin.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's start. So first, tell me about your scholarly background.
I studied international relations in my BA, MA, and PhD degrees, but in two different countries. I studied international relations at Middle East Technical University in Ankara, after which I did an MA degree, again in international relations, here at the same university that I currently work, Bilkent University. Afterwards, I wanted to study critical security studies. And at the time, there was only an opportunity to do that a few places in the world. And I went to the UK, the University of Wales at Aberystwyth, that was called at the time, to study critical security studies. That was the only one of the few places that you can actually study, have a course on critical security studies at the time. So I did an MA on critical security studies, and I continued doing a PhD on the same topic. So my background in international relations is two different countries.
Okay, that's really nice. And that is the place where they have the E.H. Carr professor, right? Chair professor.
Yeah.
And who is the chair professor there now? Do you know?
No, I don't really know. Not at the moment.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. All right.
But they are very proud of having the first chair in international politics in the world.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, that's important. So it's part of IR history. It's part of the history of the discipline.
Yes.
So, but let's get to some more specific questions about your theoretical work. So you're a prolific and creative scholar. You have done research on security, the Middle East, and also on non-Western IR theory. And I would like to focus on the latter here. So what are some of the key insights when it comes to non-Western IR research in general? Why is it important? And specifically, what is your own research focusing on?
Let me start by saying that I no longer call it non-Western international relations. I wasn't too keen on the term anyway, but I've increasingly moved away from it.
Yeah.
My starting point will give you a hint as to why I think along those lines. My PhD research, as you also highlighted, was on Middle East and critical security studies. And when I was trying to make sense of regional security dynamics in the Middle East from a critical security studies perspective, I increasingly noticed that there were limitations to our understanding of what was happening in the Middle East if we adopted either what we call nowadays the mainstream approaches, realism, idealism, etc. So they had limitations in terms of understanding the Middle East, but critical approaches too were limiting in many ways in terms of understanding Middle Eastern dynamics. Now we can respond to such limitations, a gap between our theories and what we study, in two different ways. One is to say my theory is okay, but this part of the world is not necessarily, we can't really understand it, right? This is what we call, to a certain extent, and I'm simplifying here, Orientalism. They're just different. Yeah, they need their own tools in terms of understanding.
Yeah.
Or to actually go back and look at the limitations of our own theories, not only mainstream theories that critical approaches like mine, critical security studies, talks quite a bit about, but also the limitations of critical approaches as well. So when I was doing my PhD work, I was already aware that we need to do some real serious rethinking in terms of our theoretical approaches. That was my starting point, but I got more seriously in what is nowadays also referred to as globalizing IR a couple of years afterwards. This is the early 2000s. I was invited to be a part of a project by Ule Weber and Arlene Tickner, what they called global epistemologies and international relations. And as part of that, I started thinking more seriously about this. So what specifically is going on here? What are the specific limitations of, in my case, theoretical approaches to studying this part of the world, in general, Turkey more specifically, or Mediterranean, which is another part of the world that I have studied so far. So it's my origins in critical security studies that actually brought me here into what is now referred to as globalizing IR approaches.
Yeah, or global IR or non-Western IR. What is the problem with non-Western IR from your perspective? What's the problem with that concept?
That's an excellent question, because it gets me to the gist of the argument that I have built over the years, in the sense that this is a trend of research that we actually observe in history, in sociology, and as well as international relations. IR may actually be a little bit late to this, studying events in different parts of the world, but also ideas in different parts of the world in terms of their interconnectedness, as opposed to looking at them in terms of origins in this part of the world and origins in that part of the world. You can see this in political science, critical theories, you can see it global history approaches, and also global sociology's approaches as well. The idea is that you can't really study Western international relations, if you want to call it, outside of its connectedness to ideas about international relations or practical interactions of international interactions between different parts of the world. So what we tell this, when we tell the story of what we call Western IR, it is not purely the making of some people who happen to be located in some part of the world. There's always connections. These connections may take multiple forms. It could be colonial exploitation, that's a connection, isn't it? The exploitation of material riches, that's one connection. It could be self-other relations, that's another connection. That international law, for instance, is both about material interactions, but also self-other relationships. A number of great scholars have actually written about this, or our identity as Western versus non-Western is about a self-other relationship. But thirdly, and this is something post-colonial scholars have done quite a bit on. Third relationship is the ideational. It's not just material. It's not just it's not only related to identity, but ideational, that the very institutions, the very things that we identify with one part of the world or another is not just about those parts of the world. There's always interaction. This is something that the literary critic Edward Said referred to as the interconnectedness of things. He has a book from 1975, I believe, where he says we should not be studying the origins of things because there is always multiplicity of origins. We should be studying beginnings in different parts of the world, he said. And my approach to the study of the international is similar. I'm interested in beginnings and connections, and not just one versus the other, which does not actually reveal the multiplicity of input into these things.
Yeah, so in this, there is a critique against the use of these binaries.
Yes.
And focusing on the interconnections as well, and the interconnections between civilizations as well, perhaps, rather than a clash between civilizations.
Yeah, that's part of the discussion, yes, of course.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let me continue. Could you say that there is a Turkish school of international relations, just like there is an English school of international relations?
The English School of International Relations, people who study the English school tell us that there is very little that is English about the English school. It's about the attempt to come up with a different way of studying world politics. That is what is distinctive about it. It's not in terms of cultural approach. It's an attempt to distinguish one approach from another, which was identified as an American approach to international relations. Not everyone who contributed to the American approach is American, the same way with the English school. In that sense, it is possible to have a Chinese school of international relations or a Brazilian school of international relations as well. In Turkey, there are sporadic attempts to do that, but I can't really see the emergence of a school yet. I definitely don't identify with such approaches. You can also tell from my starting point as well that I'm interested in contributing to international relations, hence the emphasis on globalizing international relations as opposed to going into our own corners and doing our own thing. I'm not saying that that's what the English school did, but some of these culturalist attempts to build schools, I don't identify with that at all.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's interesting. So we should not really understand the English school as a nationalist IR school, so to speak. And perhaps some attempts to create a Chinese IR or a Turkish IR is more along those nationalist lines. Perhaps, not necessarily, but it could be.
Culturalist, a bit revivalist, plays into certain international and domestic political dynamics as well.
Yeah, yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much. If you were to choose 2 or 3 core global IR concepts that you have worked with, which ones would you choose and why?
This notion of constitutive outside that comes from post-colonial studies has become core to my research so far. This is a notion that was proposed by Stuart Hall early on, but IR scholars David Blaney and Naim Inayatullah have picked it up to study international relations, and I'm trying to follow in their steps. It's very useful, I find, because it allows us to emphasize the outside relationship between West and non-West, if you wish. But it also emphasizes that there is a constitutive relationship between the two. So it's outside of the narratives that we read in our textbooks, of course, right? When I was a student, our history of civilizations textbook would start with ancient Greece and move from then onwards. So that's definitely outside. And when it was brought in, at best, you would get a chapter on ancient East, China perhaps, and maybe one on ancient Egypt, and that would be it in terms of the history of civilization. It has changed so far until since so much since then. But it's outside in terms of, it's still outside in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves, the narratives that we produce about international relations. There's no denying that. But the fact that it is outside of the stories that we tell ourselves does not mean that it's not there. It's a matter of recovering those relationships. It's finding out about them, writing different narratives about them. It's about doing archival research at times, turning to different sources at other times. There's a lot of material out there, only if we go looking for them. Students sometimes get discouraged of doing global IR, thinking that, oh, I have to learn so many languages, I have to go and do all this kind of research. If they're interested, I don't discourage them from doing that, but there's also a lot of material that is available in their native languages, or if in English especially, if they know. So it's not that kind of a daunting exercise. It's just that we sometimes get a little bit lazy in terms of courses that we go to, and globalizing IR is about turning to different kind of sources and tapping those sources.
Okay, so if the constitutive outside is one concept, could you add perhaps one more concept that you have worked with? At least from one of the articles that I have read, I think you introduced the concept of contrapuntal reading.
Contrapuntal reading is a method. It's coming from, again, Edward Said's work. It's a method that he has generated to be able to study exactly this, connected histories of the world. He's a literary critic. So what he was trying to do at the time was to look at the classical texts that are typically read in comparative literature classes in terms of their situatedness in history. So when he turns to Jane Austen, for instance, he's also interested in the context in which she's writing. This is not a matter of whether Austen talked about this versus that or not. It's not about criticizing the author, what she says in terms of what she says or what she does not say. It's about understanding the context that actually shape those literatures, because we are always responding to a world, right? So it may be our neighborhood, but our neighborhood is also shaped by the colonial, well, Britain is at the time an empire, so there is no denying that there are all these kinds of learnings and other kinds of relationships going on with other parts of the British Empire. So the contrapuntal reading in Edward Said's usage is about looking at these interconnected histories of people and also narratives on those histories, right? So look at different people located in different parts of the world and learn how to read them one against each other, right? Contrapuntality is coming from music, and he says one tune may make a lot of sense. You may be able to listen to it and enjoy it. Another tune would also be the same, but when they come together, they make different sense to you. It becomes an entirely different tune. It's a bit like that with our historical narratives, he says. There is one narrative there where another one, and when you read them together or against each other, an entirely different narrative emerges, and it gives us a more comprehensive picture of what we try to understand. It's a very interesting method in that sense. This is what I was also referring to as things seeming a little bit daunting at times, that you need to know at least two different contexts to be able to tell stories. But it's not that difficult, actually. There's a lot of material that is out there. I've recently been writing about studying the refugee crisis of 2015 in Europe, making use of this contrapuntal method, relationships between EU actors and Northern African actors, and look at the relationships in order to be able to understand how they have come here, what are the different dynamics in terms of understanding insecurities in this part of the world in 2015.
Yeah, and Turkey as well, right? The EU and Turkey, they have an important relationship in this matter as well, in relation to the migration crisis.
Yeah, of course. I haven't turned to Turkey to study this from a Turkish perspective yet, but definitely it can be done entirely using these methods, of course.
Yeah. All right, thank you. That's very interesting. Okay, and in terms of policy relevance, maybe that is, it's not always applicable, but I ask it anyway. In terms of policy relevance, how would non-Western IR or global IR inform policy?
It's more useful than it initially comes across. I say it initially comes across because sometimes the language that we use in our writings may come across as not relevant at all. That we seem to be talking about historical cases more often than not, and sometimes it comes across as heavy theoretical language. This is sometimes that the feedback we get from our students. But thinking about this purely theoretically, if our approaches to international relations allow us to understand only some parts of the world, right? And our aim is to study the world, not only some parts of the world, because that's what international relations is about, isn't it? That you can't just focus on American foreign policy or European foreign policy, because foreign policy is about foreigners. You need to understand them too. And if our theoretical tours are limiting in terms of understanding others, right? Others who we're interacting with, there's definitely a lot of policy relevance in terms of globalizing IR, so that you'd be able to better understand what the world looks like from their perspective. So it's entirely policy relevant, although on page it does not always come across that way. I concede that. Some of our works are highly theoretical, but there's a lot of work on nuclear weapons, for instance, from post-colonial perspectives. And when you read them, you can see how the non-proliferation, for instance, which is very hot, very topical, very policy relevant, how non-proliferation could be rethought if only we learn to pay attention to how India thinks of nuclear weapons, for instance, as opposed to focusing only on the US perspective or the British or the French perspectives. There are a great series of very interesting works on this. Scholar from India, Iti Abraham, whose work I utilize in my own work. He's a historian. It's very useful. He does history of science. A scholar based in the US, Shampoo Biswas, has also written about non-proliferation and has written very interesting work in terms of both the historical aspects, but also very contemporary aspects of India's foreign policy, and these works have implications for the non-proliferation regime, the ways in which it works and it doesn't work. And in turn, these kinds of case studies are insight into the working of nuclear weapons or non-working of nuclear weapons regime, have implications for the way in which we understand Iran or fail to understand or respond to Iran. So there's a lot of policy relevance there only if we actually adopt a different set of lenses and go and do the empirical work for them.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, actually. A lot of sense. The critique that has been raised, or the reluctance to answer or to give a specific policy advice coming from a particular theoretical perspective, is because some scholars have emphasized that the school of thought or the theory is more analytical, and there is no necessary, or there is no direct link between theory and policy advice. But it makes a lot of sense from global IR perspective, because you can actually make a lot of in-depth empirical work, and you can actually get to know the diplomats, the countries, the cultures that you're relating to and relating with. So yeah, makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much for that. I always ask, before we leave, I always ask the scholars that I interview here about any advice that they would like to give to the students. Do you have anything on mind that they would like to share?
A while ago, I read about Cynthia Enlow's advice to students of international relations. And her advice was to always be interested in some part of the world and bring back the insights of that part of the world to the theoretical work that they do. So coming back to what I said just a moment ago, the rich empirical studies that we do on this part of the world, that part of the world, we need to bring back the insights of those empirical studies into our theoretical work. Globalizing IR is not about just turning to other parts of the world and studying them, but also revisiting our theoretical approaches, identifying the limitations and trying to fix those theoretical limitations. So we have actually a more globalized IR. There's no end to this, of course. We're always learning, and the term globalizing have their limitations and problems. I acknowledge all of that, but it's about the dialogue between the empirical work that we do and the theoretical work that we do, and to keep them talking to each other. So it's a little bit of Enlow's advice. It's a little bit of my own based on what I learned from her old work as well.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. That makes a lot of sense, and I hope the students will listen to that and try to take that into consideration in their own studies. So thank you very much for participating in this interview, and yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you. It was my privilege.
Yeah. Bye-bye.